Today I have with me Professor Stephen Pow. We will be discussing today the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary in 1242, the theories around it, as well as Stephen's own specific theory regarding it. Stephen, I'm glad you could make it today.
Well, thanks for having me, Jack, as always. I mean, I presume you're going to have me in the future, so...
So Stephen last year completed his PhD, and he wrote his thesis on the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary. He's written numerous articles on the topic, so he is very familiar with both the historiography as well as the primary sources. So if you're looking to talk to someone about it, Stephen's a pretty good choice to go for. And now I suppose that we should talk a bit about our historical chronology as well as the problem we will be focusing on. So, of course, the Mongols invaded the Kingdom of Hungary in December 1240. And, of course, in the spring of 1241, they won their famous victory at Muhi, only a day or two after their also famous victory at Liegnitz in Poland. And, of course, this was the army under Batu in Subadai, had just recently completed the conquest of the Western Steppe, which included everyone west of the Ural River. After the battle at Muhi in 1241, the army of the Hungarian kingdom was effectively destroyed. And for the next year, the Mongols run rampant over the kingdom east of the Danube. They are able to cross the frozen Danube in the winter of 1241 and attack the westernmost part of the Hungarian kingdom, even riding into Austria briefly before withdrawing in the spring of 1242. The standard explanation for, I would imagine, most works on the Mongols is, of course, Ögedai Han, the Great Khan of the Mongol Empire and the son of Chinggis Khan, died on the 11th of December 1241. And the reason, therefore, that the Mongols withdrew is that they all had to rush back to Mongolia and elect the next Great Khan. However, there's a number of problems with this, or perhaps the most significant problem is that this is not actually what happened. The Mongols did not all run back to Mongolia. Batu and a number of the princes and generals, including Subadai, stayed on the Volga River. They did not return to Mongolia. Subadai, in his case, did not return to Mongolia for a couple of years. Batu never returns. And the next Great Khan is not elected until 1246. So in light of this fact, for several decades now, the scholarship has been exploring alternative explanations. And broadly, these fall into three main categories: environmental, military, and political. Stephen and I are going to go over these older explanations, assess them, offer a few criticisms, and then go into Stephen's recent alternative explanation. Now, before we go further, I'm going to have a few brief disclaimers and things I want you to keep in mind. First of all, we are not Eurocentrists or Mongol supremacists trying to justify anything or say that, oh, our side would have won or anything like that. We are not interested in that. What we are discussing here is the scholarly literature, and we are interested in what the primary sources say. That is, the surviving textual and archaeological evidence from the 13th and 14th centuries. We are not here to pick sides, and we do not care about the national myth you learned in school, where you were taught that actually your ancestors were the ones who forced the Mongols to flee. And I would also ask that you forget the popular image of the Mongol army as some sort of force of nature, unbound by physics and totally unstoppable. The Mongol army was undoubtedly impressive, but they were still humans. They fought, bled, got fatigued, and died just like everyone else. So when we talk about setbacks the Mongols suffered, do not have this feeling like we are playing down the Mongols, because the Mongols routinely suffered setbacks. They were often pushed back or had to come up with new strategies or were defeated. What makes them impressive is the fact that they were normally able to do this and normally able to come back from reverses. Remember that it took them some 70 years to complete the conquest of China. The Mongols did not just show up and have everyone immediately die in front of them.
I'll just quickly say, the impressive element of the Mongol conquest is that it did happen in the real world like we know today, with its constraints of human physiology and everything else, and that psychologically the Mongols were very determined, and even if they lost or even if an army's commander died, they'd come back again the next year. There was this ruthless persistence that often paid off in their conquest. And that's the lesson. That's a big lesson from the Mongol Empire. It might not be as comic book-like as we would have it, that they're just invincible in combat, but it's still a valuable story because it's useful in our own lives, because it was this world that they conquered in, this very same 3 dimensions.
But I think too that people tend to sort of retroactively look at a limit of conquest and assume that that is some sort of hard point, that's like predetermined. They won't go beyond this, that there's some sort of almost like a line in the sand that once you cross that sand, now the army doesn't work anymore. And that's not how history works. It's not any predefined path that the Mongols, there's no, in my opinion, there's no inherent quality about Europe that stops it from being conquered by the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. It's the way the 13th century ends up playing out that such a conquest never happens, but there's not anything inherently special that means Europe does not end up getting conquered, while China, Iran, basically everything else in the Eurasian continent does end up getting conquered.
Yeah, I think there in the Mongol worldview, there's no exceptions to the demand for world conquest. The Teb Tengri didn't. This was the shaman who told Chinggis Khan his destiny was to conquer the world. Although, that's what that stories say. And Chinggis Khan may have come up with this idea himself as well, let's not forget. But they had a belief that Chinggis Khan and his dynasty was going to conquer the world, and there weren't exceptions to this, like except for Europe. Don't conquer Europe. There's no special destiny of Europe in the 1200s Mongolian worldview. There's nothing special about Europe. And that's a key thing to imagine when we imagine this invasion of Europe in the 1240s.
And I think as we'll probably get into this a bit more later, but if there had been political and military will and the resources put to the task, then they would have conquered Europe. It's sort of the fluke of history that such a thing does not develop. And in short, the adequate resources never get put to the region for such a purpose. So we'll start first with perhaps the most famous theory, that is the political one. And that is that the death of Ögedei Han in December 1241 caused the Mongol withdrawal. Often perhaps the most popular for people interested in the Mongol Empire, because it preserves sort of the military legacy or military reputation of the Mongols. Because by supporting that theory, you're not saying the Mongols had to retreat because of any sort of military losses or military needs, but they had to retreat because their political system demanded it. That if Ögedei hadn't died, the implication usually is that the Mongols would have gone on and conquered everything in Europe up to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, not just sea, but many scholars have pointed out a number of issues with this. We pointed out at the start already, the princes did not all immediately rush back to Mongolia. Batu stays for several years on the Volga, as well as numerous other princes, and Subadai stays with him as well.
We have two years recorded in Subatai's biography that help shed some light on the very end of this campaign in Europe. The termination, and then Subutai going back to Mongolia. In 1243, the records record that Batu did not want to go to the assembly that was being called in Mongolia. And Subutai said, "How can you refuse to go?" And then, sort of misleadingly, the following year, 1244, the biography of Subutai states that Batu and some other princes held a Hariltai on the Volga River, which is, of course, very far away from Mongolia, and that's where Batu established Batu Sarai, his capital, or his brother Berka continued it. But this was his base. This became the base of the Golden Horde, the Volga River. So it seems like the biography is trying to smooth something over. It's trying to say that Batu didn't want to participate in an assembly in 1243, and Subutai said, "You have to go. You're one of the older brothers of the imperial family." And then in 1244, he did participate in a Hariltai, mind you, on the Volga River. And what we might take this as is this was the final parting of the army, the 1244 event on the Volga River. Let's take it as a historical fact. And this is when Subutai is probably given permission to leave. And we know from both his biography and from John of Plano Carpini, who you are going to mention, that in 1246, Subutai is back in the Mongol capital, or Mongol horde's capital.
Yeah, in Karakorum, in Mongolia. Yeah. So, and that's really demonstrated when people say the Mongols all had to go back to Mongolia for the election. There was no immediate election. The army did not go back to Mongolia. There's political struggles in Mongolia until 1246, as Ögedai's widow, the regent Turagene, is essentially trying to maneuver things into place to ensure that her son, Guyuk, becomes Khan. And it takes her several years of essentially bribery, forcing people into place to get enough support, because there were other sons of Ögedai, his grandsons, who were all possible contenders. So with that being said, though, does it still make sense for Ögedai's death to have caused a withdrawal? Though it is popular for people to say this, that the Mongols had this rule, everyone had to fall back to Karakorum, or the capital, and elect the next Great Khan. This is not really the case, though. First of all, this is never outlined as a requirement in the sources. The only requirement in the Mongol Empire for a legal election is for all the representatives of the family of Chinggis Khan's four sons with Berti. Representatives from each of these lineages had to be present, and the election had to be held in the Onan, in the region of the Onan River in northeastern Mongolia. Though people love to repeat this, everyone had to run back and elect the Khan. There's not really that many examples of that happening specifically. What we often see is the princes' armies continuing to function, to fight, and be on campaign after the Khan dies. Hubelai Khan himself, after the death of his brother Mönk in 1259, continues to campaign after Mönk's death. After Guyuk's death, after Ögedai's death, armies in the Middle East are continuing to campaign, to march into India. This is often an extrapolation on the part of sort of modern writers, but there's not really that much support for it. It's never outlined as a rule. So Batu, his presence is not required. It would be obviously better if he was there, being that he was one of the senior princes of the family. So his presence would have been very good, but not required. He could have just sent a representative. Orda, Batu's older brother, who was on campaign, he actually gets along very well with Guyuk. And Guyuk did not get along very well with Batu. They had sort of fought with each other during the course of the campaign in the Rus principalities. Batu was not really that good of a commander. There's a couple cases of him needing to be helped out at sieges. And this conflict between them even shows up in the secret history of the Mongols, where Guyuk is calling Batu old woman Batu, and they're insulting each other. And so this conflict was well known. Ögedai had essentially declared every single one of his sons and grandsons, except Guyuk, at various points and probably various stages of sobriety, as being his possible heirs. But Guyuk, as the oldest son of, it was probably recognized that Guyuk was a likely contender. Batu, probably not in a rush to go and take part in that.
The older brothers seem to have sometimes, you could say an older brother, even this term Akka and Ini, the older and younger brothers, a senior brother probably had an advantage. Certainly did, if we look at the general picture of succession, even in Mongol and successor states, but it wasn't guaranteed. Chinggis Khan's successor was his third son, Ögedai.
But the question, though, could Batu and the army in Western Hungary have even learned of Ögedai's death by the time the withdrawal began in 1242? Now, Stephen has tackled this problem thoroughly in his thesis.
The only way the political explanation for Ogedai's death being the cause of Batu's withdrawal, the only way that this can work, this theory, is if we imagine that it's possible that messengers reached Hungary from Mongolia in a few short months, because Ögedei died December 11th. We have the exact date from the records. December 11th, 1241, Ögedei dies. The Mongols withdrew at the end of March, according to a European source, and many sources kind of corroborate this picture that there's still snow on the ground. It was early letters corroborate that the Mongols are already
the European
gone.
source, so that's Master Roger, and I'll just mention this. He's not just a guy. He was actually captured by the Mongols and sort of forced. He was traveling with the army during most of its withdrawal through Hungary. So he's a direct eyewitness, and he basically records the exact moment when the withdrawal begins, more or less.
Yeah, and it couldn't have been very late in the spring. And so anyway, December 11th to, let's say, April 1st. This isn't, or even say middle of April, even though we ought not to say that, going by the source material, but let's say that only gives how many months? 4 months.
Yeah.
4 months to cross the whole of... 4 months or less to cross the whole of Eurasia, basically, and not just any season. Ask anyone who lives in Yakutsk, Kazakhstan, Siberia. Ask these people if the travel conditions are just as easy by land in the winter as in the summer or spring. They might say, well, you have the advantage. Someone might say, Mongols had the advantage, that's why they chose to attack Russia in the winter, because the rivers and the mud would freeze, whereas in the spring and summer you have the mud. But still, there's a whole set of problems that come with winter travel, including dying of exposure, blizzards, and this is the very coldest season when Ögedei dies. And yes, these are Mongols, yes, they have adapted their lifestyle to be able to survive in horrifying blizzard conditions, that even freeze the livestock solid. This just happened in recent times, several times. We've seen Mongolian livestock frozen standing. This is how bad the climate how severe it can be.
And this is in a winter too. The winter of 1241 is also one described as particularly terrible. You have the calculations in your thesis. You essentially took all of the travel accounts from people who traveled the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries and the length of time it took them to get between various points. And now, these are not just a merchant going across the distance. Most of these are envoys, diplomats, messengers who are traveling with Mongol messengers through the Yam system, the famous postal stations. And it is still taking them approximately 100 days to travel from Karakorum to Sarai on the Volga. Now it's 100 days, so that's about 4 months, right?
Yeah.
Right there.
And we mustn't forget, even the end of March could have been when the Mongols were withdrawing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what one source specifically says. So we have less than 4 months for these.
Yeah.
And that's presuming messengers leave to go to Europe on the day Ögedei dies.
So remember what we said a few minutes ago about Guyuk and Batu having a falling out and not getting along well. This was presumably known well to the Mongolian court. The secret history of the Mongols portrays it as such. There's been messengers probably going back and forth between the armies for years. Guyuk, he'd left the army just before the sack of Kiev in December 1240. And he and Munk both went back to Mongolia. He's not quite back in Mongolia as of yet. But you have to imagine this. His mother, Turgene, she's been the one in charge of the Mongolian government for the last few years of Ögedei's life. She's always wanted her oldest son, Guyuk, to succeed his father, Ögedei. And she's been planning for this for years. She's been putting stuff in motion, building her war chest, so to speak, and basically watching Ögedei drink and drink and drink himself to death. So on the morning of December 11th, 1241, she walks into Ögedei's camp, finds his stinking, bloated corpse lying on the floor. Now, he wasn't in Karakoram, though, was he, when he died? It was a bit south?
Yeah, it was south. It's not substantially, but it was south of Karakoram in a place called Utegu Kulan, or Hulan, which is...
Old wild horse mountain.
Yeah, old wild ass, special kind of wild ass of Mongolia, the Kulan. It's still there, I think. And then there was a mountain, and so now this has become a national park, not because of Ögedei's death, but despite it. It became a popular... It's a nice scenic place, so that's probably where he was. But for our purposes, it wasn't any closer to Hungary than if he had died in Karakoram.
It was essentially a couple days travel away from Karakoram.
Right,
so,
and if he died in a more remote place where information could be controlled better.
Yeah,
and that's another factor we might
exactly. This is not in the big palace in Karakoram. It's in a hunting camp some ways south of the city. So Torgini, she knows Guyuk's coming home. She knows Guyuk and Batu had a falling out, and now Ögedei is dead. Presumably only the staff in the palace itself, or in the camp at Utegu Kulan, know that he's dead. Now, if you're Torgini Hatun, and you know your son has had a falling out with Batu, is it in your interest to recall Batu immediately and have him show up right away with a huge army at his back, and presumably solve the issue with Guyuk's, with their falling out, or ensured Guyuk didn't make it to the throne?
We can take a modern example just because human nature is what it is. When Stalin died, the system was very unstable. You know, it's a empire, massive Eurasian empire. When Stalin died, Beria, and I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but Beria did not want Zhukov to know. He didn't want this to be broadcast on the media. There was tight control at first. There's a meeting of a very tiny group of people, and they're saying, what should we do here? Because this is a highly volatile, highly dangerous situation. And long story short, people in Karakoram who were supporters of Guyuk or his son or whatnot, like the queen, Toragene, she's not going to want this information to go out right away with no plan to a massive army by a potential rival, Batu, under a potential rival. So there can be a delay, and maybe even the information would get out involuntarily. I don't know, I wasn't there, but there's going to be some kind of control that's going to delay the message going out right away.
In short, what we're saying is that it's highly unlikely that the news of Ögedei's death broke out immediately on December 11th when his body was found. Might even have been a couple days later. Might even have been a month later. We don't know precisely. Sure, we don't have that information.
There would have been an attempt to silence any kind of rumors about this, and I mean, this happened when the first emperor of China died, Qin Shi Huangdi.
Yeah.
Same when Genghis Khan died. It's very similar. But it's not so different with Genghis Khan. There's a very mysterious thing where this is a very volatile time, because there's people who want the throne, there's people who want to be the successor, and they don't like each other, and they have big armies.
Well, we literally have all of these sources about Genghis Khan's death having him say, keep my death a secret. And so there's already precedent in the Mongol Empire for this being the case. So I would imagine at the very least Torgene is keeping the news of Ögedei's death from spreading at least until Guyuk is in Karakoram itself, or closer to the capital, or sort of till he's in place. In addition to the fact that it seems incredibly unlikely that even if they left on December 11th, 1241, that these messengers would have traveled all the way over Asia in the middle of winter. And this is before a proper yam system has been set up. All right. There's kind of what we get from the travel accounts is kind of a pretty, like immediately after this period is a kind of a pretty sparse setup. This is just after the Mongol conquest. When Batu returns to the steppes in what's now Ukraine, the first thing they had to do was put down a Kipchak revolt. So this land has not even been fully consolidated yet. There is no quote-unquote highway from Karakorum to Western Hungary at this point. And even briefly on the remark of it taking 100 days to get from Karakorum to Sarai on the Volga, it's probably another, I would think at least another 2 months from the Volga River to Western Hungary, where Batu and the army actually was.
A lot of information about how fast, and it is impressive. The Mongol postal system is one of the great accomplishments of medieval history, and Marco Polo from Italy said as much. But he was talking about the system from Mongolia through China, where they'd already kind of inherited a postal system from the Liao dynasty earlier, and even from the Uyghur times, and they had this sort of system like this going through Asia. And so Marco Polo's information about how many, like 100 kilometers in a day or more, it's not really useful, because that's when you have a tightly controlled, densely populated network.
Now the YAM systems, they require a significant local population to support them, because there's just a ton of information on all these local populations complaining about being essentially extorted by the users of the YAM system and stuff. So it seems doubtful that any sort of proper communication network, or at least a fully organized one, was properly set up. And for point of comparison with Marco Polo there, that's also, when he's talking about that at the end of the 13th century, that's also in a region where the Mongols have ruled it for 60, 70, 80 years. They have total control. Like you said, there's this huge population base versus they've only finished conquering this part of the Western steppe, at most 5 years before. There's revolts. There's a lot of confusion. It's in the midst of establishing that new administration. And it's in the middle of winter, having to cross all the way across Asia. And like we've already said, this news is almost certainly unlikely to have left immediately upon the finding of Ogedai's body. Now,
a European traveler, just as a last point, went to Kazakhstan and endured the winter, and he watched as winds came and upturned the yurts, the gurs of the people, the tents, these big felt tents that people in Central Asia nomads have used. He saw them become unrooted and throw the people inside the tents around, and he said this is much more rough and rugged. The dead of winter in the steppe is not such a beautiful, poetic idea as you might think. It's grueling, and the conditions are life-threatening, and so you even have to wonder, imagine one messenger had been dispatched. Do they really think he's going to make it to Hungary? Are they absolutely sure he's not going to die on the journey? Sorry, we're covering every detail, but when you add it all up, this is what I said in my dissertation and in an article you can get it's part of a volume. It's called Mongol Inroads into Hungary.
Yeah, that's in the Routledge Handbook of the Mongols in East Central Europe or something. We'll put it on screen here, and you can get it from Routledge.
Alexander Mayarov and Roman Hautala have put together a volume with a lot of the scholars from East Central Europe. So it's the latest.
Yeah. This is not being sponsored, but click this link. I will not, wherever the link's going to be. I will not get paid for this, so just read this if you want to learn more. Yes, and we're assuming that any messengers who left even went across the steppe, because it's foreseeable that they cut through area the Mongols had greater control over. So through Central Asia, Transoxiana, went south around the Caspian, through northern Iran, came up through the Caucasus, and met Batu's army through that route. So you can see, so from Karakorum to Kiev, 142 days.
Yeah, this is a map designed by a Hungarian fellow and myself, both having interest in this topic, how long it would take to get from Mongolia to Hungary. And these are some of the travelers in the Middle Ages who made either some or all of this journey. Very telling one is Benedict the Pole and John of Plano Carpini, because they travel from Kiev to Karakorum. It's most of the distance, but not. It's still a long ways to Budapest from there to Hungary. And it was 142 days, and Carpini and Benedict the Pole both mentioned that they would switch horses, and they were traveling with the Mongol postal riders, and they were switching horses several times per day to keep the horses going as fast as they could trot.
They're essentially riding like Mongol messengers would, because they were traveling on the Yam route.
Yeah, and you can't really overwork the horse, or else you're in a much worse situation, if you keep losing horses on this route. So, and a lot of their journey, that long one there, was in the cold season. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And Marco Polo did say travel was harder in the Mongol Empire in the cold season. Slower, specifically.
Now, I would add, too, now, we're also not just making like what ifs and things based on calculations. There are primary sources that say the Mongols did not learn of Ögedei's death until after the withdrawal began. Rashid al-Din, the great Ilkhanid vizier and historian, arguably the single most important source on the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, he says as much, that they don't learn of Ögedei's death until they're already back in the steppe. Now, there is John de Plano Carpini, who is a Franciscan friar who travels through all of these lands. We just saw him on the map there. He travels through the Mongol Empire to arrive at Guyuk's enthronement in 1246. Now, he does say something to the effect of he thought the withdrawal was due to Ögedei's death. He was not part of the army. He's not access to internal Mongol military documents or anything. This was when he's learning of these things during his route. He puts two and two together and he makes that assumption.
Yeah, he was asking people, but we don't know if these people told him the truth. We don't know what they actually told him, because part of it's his own interpretation, and we don't know if it's a cover-up. So if they said, oh, the Khan died, so we had to go back, say a Mongol told him that, it might be not true. It doesn't have to be true. And a Russian, if Russians told him that this could be what they heard. It doesn't necessarily, or how they were explaining it, because he did have some Russian informants, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. The
timing is suspect. It's hard to not look at, wow, Ögedei dies, the army retreats, and go, wow, this lines up really well. But when you get into it, it's such a feat to have made the distance from Karakorum to Western Hungary in less than 4 months. I would argue in the dead of winter, it's effectively impossible. And this is all on horseback. These are not estimates on someone walking on foot. These are all the estimates of someone making this journey on horseback.
And Jack, you have some experience with horses, right? Unlike many of us Canadians and North Americans who, will talk about these things without really knowing much about the raising of horses and how to keep them from dying. What kind of insights would you add on this? Because,
well, the first thing to remember is the fact that the Mongols generally feed their horses off of fodder, through grazing. Generally do not supply grains and things for their horses. So they are not traveling between depots, say, or carrying a bunch of feed with them or a supply train for these messengers. The expectation would be normally your horses, you ride part of the day and the horse feeds off of the grass and stuff to sustain itself. This is a lot harder in winter. Obviously, if there's a proper yam route set up, then they just change horses at all of these stations. But as we've been saying, it's unlikely this yam route set up part of the day. So if there's not a proper yam route set up and a fellow has to ride a horse longer than necessary, now he has to take part of the day out to feed the horse. And I don't mean he has to take some grain, oats, barley out of his knapsack and put it into a feed bag on the horse, because he's not carrying that. Let's be generous and say this guy's traveling with 5 horses and changing a horse every single day. He should be doing it more than that if he's riding all day, but if you're feeding a horse just off of grass, like a steppe pony off of grass, I think the rule of thumb from what I've heard is like you give them like the whole like ride for the morning and then they eat grass the rest of the day. If you want this horse to live, if you're going to keep riding it on and on and on. A horse is not a car. It will burn a lot of energy just to stay warm. And that's why you normally feed extra in the winter anyways, and you'll feed instead of like 2 meals in the day, then you'll split it out into smaller meals. You keep that heat up. And with grains and things, we say that they burn hotter is what we call it here. Just because I don't really know how to say it. It gets the horse hotter, keeps it warmer. But grass doesn't get as hot, especially grass that's dormant, doesn't have a lot of nutrients, buried under snow. Now, of course, that's making the assumption that the guy is doing it, that he doesn't have postal stations and stuff. If he does have some sort of postal stations, it's still going to be a harder route. If this is deep snow, the horse has to work a lot harder. It's going slower. A horse is still going to suffer from the cold. The Mongols do not generally coat their horses because they just rely on the winter coats and everything. But if you end up in extreme conditions and the horse is fatigued, then it's going to struggle to basically say it can get exhausted, weak, not going to run as efficiently, like all of these things. It's just everything's harder in the snow. There's not much of an advantage to doing that.
And if you look at Rubric here, the Green Line, he's another European emissary who traveled with Mongols. And just to get to that point about the grass that you mentioned, and that these animals can die, and then you're really in trouble if you're in the middle of Central Asia in the dead of winter with no horse anymore. They all died. You're guaranteed you're probably going to die too. And this Green Line, this is Rubric's journey with Mongolians, and he said there was this one really risky part, because he goes, there's only a little grass along the bank of the creek, and you're moving along this creek, and there's just this thin line of grass. And if someone didn't have this knowledge of horses that you're mentioning, that line just might not mean anything. But really, it's about this thin line of keeping these animals that are keeping you alive from starving.
It's highly unlikely the messengers got there before the army withdrew. We have sources backing this up. There isn't a requirement for Mongol troops to have to return to the capital for the election, and there isn't desire in the capital to have this army returned right away. So that's why not just us, but many scholars are unconvinced by the political explanation. Now, there was infighting in the army, but it does not seem to have been a primary instigator in any of their movements that is causing them. They were not falling back because some princes wanted to. This would have been a decision by the army command as a whole. The environment, these are a bit more recent explanations. Now we'll start with the older one first. Probably not as well known anymore, but it was an article by Dennis Sinor in the 1970s, I think. And essentially, he made a calculation. And this calculation was that the Great Plain in Hungary lacks sufficient pasturage to support a massive herd of Mongol horses and other associated, assuming they had other livestock with them. And therefore, if this pasture cannot support Mongol horses and livestock, then it cannot support a Mongol presence. Therefore, the Mongols withdrew before they starve their animals to death. Now, Stephen outlined a peculiar trend regarding signers' numbers with this theory.
Yes, there's a strange discrepancy between the numbers of animals that Dennis Sinor estimated the entire Hungarian Carpathian Basin, the Kingdom of Hungary, at the time in the Middle Ages. He estimated that it could hold 66,000, roughly, 68,000 horses in total. That was the maximum capacity of Hungary. And therefore it just didn't have enough. It couldn't handle enough horses that the Mongols could base their army and continue their conquest there. So he said there's a geographical reason that the Mongols didn't conquer Hungary or Europe, and they didn't stay in Hungary, especially, is because you could only have 68,000 horses there. And he did this by estimating that every horse needs 120 acres of grass, of pasturage per year, based on, he said, American horse breeding statistics. These are two totally different things. An American horse and let alone 120 acres sounds absolutely like a gross overestimate.
It depends dramatically on the quality of that grassland too. Because if 120 acres of nice lush grass, you put a lot of horses on that. 120 acres of like thin little shrub in like Texas or something, yeah, you'll get animals on that, but you'll struggle to get a season out of that. And like you said too, these are also estimates for larger, like modern American horses.
So just Dennis Sinor made his theory originally in 1972, and it comes from a good point. He said Batu never returned to Mongolia, therefore this political theory doesn't make any sense. Great point. But then he said, well, they left Hungary because of this geographical reason, because they could only have 68,000 maximum troops. Troops, actually, not horses. Troops. 68,000 soldiers total, because they'd all need 3 horses. But then in 1999, and Dennis Sinor he lived a long time, so many decades had passed, and he wrote about his theory again about, 30 years later, and suddenly the numbers had all changed. Suddenly, the Great Hungarian Plain had way more pasturage. Horses needed way less acres of pasturage per horse. But suddenly, the Mongols each had 5 horses instead of 3. And so he got the number low again. He said, ta-da! See? 80-some thousand or 88,000 Mongol troops maximum. And I think what he was doing, and yeah, I can't speak for him, but I think what he was doing, as a historian, was trying to keep the number nicely below 100,000, and especially below 130,000, because that's the numbers that we find in a medieval source for the size of the Mongol army. But in any case, it doesn't really matter, because in the end, what I did in my dissertation, you see the results here. I had a lot of really good Hungarian colleagues, and one of them is a sort of agriculture expert, medieval agriculture, Laszlo Ferenczy. I called him Lazzi, and he and I got together and discussed this whole thing and said, well, let's actually go to the early modern, the earliest numbers we can get for exact numbers of livestock in specific little areas. In the 1500s, for instance, 1600s in some cases. But you're getting numbers that are nowhere near. They're much bigger, let's say. These numbers are much bigger of the amount of livestock than what Sinor had estimated in his early or his later numbers. It's just they could pack way more animals into these tiny little sections. So just to pick one, what should we go with here? 30,000 cattle in this little yellow block. Just a fragment of Hungary.
So this would be what, 400 years after the Mongol invasion. So because this is 1600s, these numbers.
Yeah, and then what's important is that animal husbandry hadn't changed in Hungary really. There was no modernization in that gap. Mm-hmm. They were still in the 1800s. They were still raising animals, and lifestyles were very similar to the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm.
The big changes in the Hungarian landscape and agriculture, these don't come along until later 1800s and especially the 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
Very traditional way of life in the country.
And like as a whole, the theory, it requires the Mongols just knowing how much pasture was in Hungary and was available in Hungary. And just after, and sure, they would scout these things out, and I'm sure they had their means of making estimates. But it's like knowing, like, first of all, the Mongols never really cared that much about, like, they would, if they overgrazed the region, they wouldn't care, because to them, all of Hungary is being treated essentially as a single pasture. So for nomadic pastoralists, what you do, you use one pasture for part of the season, and then you move your herds to the next pasture and the next pasture. And this is just how the Mongols work. So first of all, this is assuming that they're putting all of their horses in Hungary anyways, which why would they do that when you cross the Carpathians and then you're in the steppe? Or you go south and then there's those grasslands along the Danube, south of the Carpathians. So this is requiring the Mongols just leaving all of their army and permanently seeing Hungary itself as a spot just to leave all of their army. Which I imagine the people who kind of repeat this theory and it's almost like if you're imagining Europe as just like, say, a map on the page here, and you like Spain, France, and it goes over, and it's one of those maps of Europe where it cuts off like at the start of the Black Sea. So Europe ends here. So none of this really matters. So you're only seeing this, the Hungarian Basin, or Pannonian Basin, as this is where the army is, and this is where the army stays, and you need to stay here to attack all the rest of this. But that's not how the Mongols are going to see it. They never, and we see this all over their conquests, they never see within like these restricted geographic terms, because they're coming from the steppe. They've just traveled all the way across Asia. To them, it is absolutely nothing to leave Hungary for a season, for a year, feed their horses back in the steppes in the Pontic steppes north of the Black Sea, leave them there, and come back the next year. This is nothing to them.
I'd almost describe it like a board game approach. Dennis Sinor's theory is almost a board game. Like, you can only be on the tiles that are marked Kingdom of Hungary, and you can't take your horsemen off those, so therefore you're stuck. But the reality is that just south of the Carpathian Mountains is Wallachia, which is one of the 3 sections of modern Romania. Wallachia was always inhabited by Cumans and Pechenegs and whatnot. Nomadic steppe people would come in. It was almost like a funnel that they'd go around the Carpathian Mountains, and that's a steppic, not steppic, this word doesn't exist, I keep thinking it exists, but that's a steppe vegetation region. That's a grassland. A lot of Wallachia is grassland, and it's kind of funny to imagine that the Mongols wouldn't figure out to just move their armies into any of these regions to get the grass that's still there if they were running short.
It's like this image of, they're nomads, and then they're going to get in Hungary and just stop being nomads. It's also, too, when people seeing sort of the Mongols as just, they're just like following the Magyars, and they're following the Avars, and they're following the Huns, where it's like you go to the steppe and you just stay there because there isn't any pretensions beyond that. But the Mongols have pretensions for all of that. Literally the rest of Europe. We know they want to conquer the rest. We have plenty of letters from the great khans to the popes to the kings demanding they come and submit. So seeing Hungary, the steppe, as like the natural endpoint, it's silly because nowhere else in Asia is the steppe the endpoint for the conquests. And to me, it seems ridiculous to argue that somehow Hungary is insufficient pasture to leave the Mongols for a season, when the Mongols, in only a couple of years prior to this, 1232, when they're attacking the Jin dynasty, Ögedei sends an army to spend the season in Tibet. Now, are you going to argue to me that Hungary has less pasture available to it than Tibet. Now, and what ends up happening, though, because there is insufficient pasture in Tibet, is a whole bunch of the army dies. There's accusations of cannibalism and things like that, and they're only there a couple months. But that's what happens when there is insufficient pasturage. And we get reports of that in the sources. And if the Mongols had been starving in Hungary at any point, well, you're damn well sure there would have been Europeans writing up, look, the Mongols, God punished them for their sins and they ran out of food and they started eating each other. They would have loved that.
Exactly, and that's the biggest, maybe that's, from my point as a historian, from my perspective, one of the biggest problems with this environmental theory of Sinor, or a later theory that just came out in 2016 by Nicola de Cosmo and Buntgen, and they argued that the kind of bad, wet, cold conditions in Hungary in the winter of 1241-42 especially caused a temporary problem that the Mongols nonetheless took as evidence, caused an environmental problem, a problem with food, a problem with grass growing, that the Mongols took as evidence that Hungary was unsuitable for their occupation. And so they left. So there's a bunch of problems with this theory, like, really the Mongols conquering the world wouldn't just try again next year? Like, they're quite persistent with China. They come to northern China year after year. They come to Tibet several times. They come to Korea, not suitable for horses, really, mass horse producing. They conquered Korea, though, and the Koreans were persistent, and the Mongols were persistent. The southern Chinese, the Song dynasty, they fought back hard against the Mongols, and the Mongols just kept coming and pummeling their agriculture in Sichuan, which was the breadbasket of southern China, just mercilessly destroying everything they could, any attempts to set up an infrastructure there. How come they gave up so easily on Hungary? So this is one problem I have with any kind of environmental theory. Like you said, but the second one relates exactly to what you said. And it applies to both Sinor's theory and the later theory. And it's, how come the medieval sources, especially the Europeans, don't speak about any kind of divine deliverance by God as revealed by what happened to the environment that made... How come there's no siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib in the Old Testament where, a disease comes and wipes out the army of the Assyrians? And they say it's a deliverance. How come there's no deliverance? How come European authors argue the opposite? They say the ice froze over on the Danube River, the conditions favored the Mongols, and nothing, and it was very cold and brutally cold, and that's not good for the European war effort. And it helped the Mongols cross the river. The conditions were boggy at the Battle of Muhi, which was bad for the Hungarian army, and apparently helped out the Mongols. And there's never any mention that, thank goodness that the Mongols were all starving at the end, though. And as you well know, in 1285, an incident that wasn't even considered by these authors, because it's very obscure, but the Mongols invaded Europe again, and this time there was a blizzard, there was starving Mongols eating each other, there was an epidemic that broke out, and guess what all the European sources said? They say, God has delivered us.
And in that case, it's not even just European sources. There's Rus sources saying this. It's showing up in Mamluk Egypt. Everyone heard about this. Now, in Sinor's theory, too, so he essentially argues it's a very wet spring and it's so muddy that the Mongols can't advance. Now, there is, this is true if you don't want your horses staying in really muddy ground. It'll cause hoof diseases and rot their hooves and things. And we do have cases where the Mongols do retreat because of mud. Ghazan, the Khan of the Ilkhanate, from 1295 to 1304, I think. So he wins the only major Ilkhanate victory over the Mamluks in 1300, start of 1300, Wadi al-Khaznadar. So the only real Mongol victory in the war against the Mamluks. Now, he ends up retreating a bit later in the season, or later in the spring before the onset of the summer heat. probably he figured there wasn't sufficient resources to make the crossing across through Palestine, across the Sinai Peninsula, and to Cairo, and probably a fair assumption. Now, but he comes back in the fall of 1300. Might even be 1301. I don't quite remember the exact date. Anyways, he comes back 1300, and he has to turn back because it is a huge rainstorm which turns all the routes to mud. So this is an occasion where this is specifically described by the primary sources. I think Rashid al-Din says, I think the Mamluk sources agree with it. So there it is, specifically described. And we don't have this description in any of the sources on Hungary. And we have lots of sources talking about the Mongol invasion of Hungary. There's eyewitnesses, Master Roger, there's Thomas of Split, there's numerous letters from the King of Hungary, the Holy Roman Emperor. This even shows up in a number of Persian sources, and obviously a bit removed from it. It shows up even in the Yuan Shi. This is the first battle on European soil to be described in a Chinese source as the Battle of Mui. And in none of these sources is it presented as a retreat due to the environment, not even the European sources. And including the eyewitness European sources who were Master Roger, who were literally in the Mongol army. There's no indication of the environment turning against them.
And Master Roger was a cleric. He probably spent months of his life hoping for a sign, and he wasn't really seeing any. It looked like Hungary had been abandoned to its fate, which is often how these clerics described it in 1241-42. Whereas, although a lot of people did see the 1285 event as a needless tragedy, they'd rather not be invaded by the Mongols. Still, a lot of them said of divine deliverance. The Mongols were smited like the Egyptians in the Old Testament. So if you didn't have 1285, then you could maybe argue that an argument from silence is not good. An argument from silence is where you say you base your argument on the fact that people didn't say something. But when you have all these examples through the ages, but it's specifically with Mongols in Hungary even, you have the 1285 example. What would happen if there was an environmental disaster that afflicted the Mongols? And it turns out literally everybody across the world who wrote anything about that invasion documents it.
Now, you were involved in writing a counter article to De Cosma's argument regarding this reign and stuff. And I think it got picked up a lot by a lot of news media and stuff, saying Mongol invasion solved, it was due to rain and stuff. Now, you wrote a counter article, and De Cosma, he wrote a counter article back at you guys. Was there anything? Now, I think did he really address your points? And has there been anything further in that back and forth since then?
Well, I wouldn't say I was involved in the article. I'm just joking. But what I realized from that experience is that maybe, we could have been more collegial. We could have been more polite, because there's a human dynamics at play in this academic world, especially, and it's not always that the truth alone triumphs or that the data will carry the day. There's also got to be, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it, it's who says it, etc. So that was a learning experience, but I thought, they just wanted to move on to other pastures, excuse the pun.
Stepping up their game, as it were.
Yeah, and it was just sort of a muddy situation.
We rained on your parade to really get caught up.
We'd rained on their parade a bit, and
actually, sort of on that point, we are not trying to take shots at these scholars. These are all very skilled scholars. Nicola de Cosma's done some very fascinating, great work, sort of highlighting a lot of these, what a lot of the climactic data says and how it affected the Mongols, and especially his one about the dry conditions in late 12th century Mongolia, and sort of how this would have aggravated the warfare in the steppe, leading to Chinggis Khan's unification of the Mongols in 1206. It's a great article, great evidence, and then he has the follow, and as part of that, he shows how Mongolia enters this extraordinary period of warm and wet weather at the start of the 13th century. Now, what he's doing there is showing it's not wet weather causes the Mongol expansion. It's this helps sort of consolidate Chinggis Khan's rule. And if you're part of the new Mongol Empire, it looks like after some harsh years of the late 12th century, early 13th century, much nicer conditions, it would appear as if heaven is sort of favoring Mongol rule. And this shows up a lot in the Chinese sources, and sort of what we've been talking about here is often this idea of heaven, the Almighty God, whatever, will portray favor for the ruling dynasty through favorable weather conditions. It's not an unusual thing, and usually good weather, sign of heaven's support, bad weather, a mandate of heaven is being rescinded. We just released a video on kings and generals on the fall of the Yuan dynasty, and how the Yuan Shi and this paleoclimactic data shows that with the onset of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century, things went tail end up in China. There was like annual earthquakes, locust, famine, plague, snowstorms, tsunami, like you name it, it was affecting them. And if you're on the ground, it looks like the mandate of heaven's lost. The Mongols do not anymore have heaven's support for their rule. Like, we're not saying they're wrong with these, with the data they took. It probably was a very wet spring in Hungary in 1242. We're not arguing that. What's being argued is that it affected the Mongols and caused them to withdraw, and that they saw this mud as sufficient. Now, maybe it made them think like, okay, this is not in favor of staying in Hungary, but it's not. Mud is not going to be the decide. And I don't think he actually even says they withdrew because of mud. He says it's sort of like okay, it could have been a consideration, but I don't remember.
The fundamental thing for me, like you, and for many people in Hungary at that, as a response to that article around 2016-17, I wasn't the one who proposed it. There were a lot of people saying this doesn't work, and they were the experts on the medieval landscape in Hungary. This is their whole life and research is devoted to this. A lot of people were saying this doesn't work, but from my point of view, the biggest problem was the medieval sources. I mean, I just knew right away. I'm like, let's see what you got from medieval sources, because I guarantee you don't got nothing, because I know the sources. I know you're not going to be able to show anything here. Like, and they were able to show a famine in Hungary. It's like, well, the Mongols caused famine in northern China. They caused famine in Armenia. They intentionally trigger famines. They trampled the crops in Armenia, for instance. If you prevent people from planting, that doesn't demonstrate that there was no grass in the country to feed the horses, or whatever the issue is. I just knew that to me it seems honestly like an easy out that can make everyone happy, in a way. In modern historiography, you can go, okay, the Mongols left because of bad weather or bad conditions. Everyone wins. Hungary was saved. The Mongols had to leave, but they leave with their banners high, and everyone, and it's just the environment. It's just how it is. Problem solved. Look no further. But it just does not. I don't think it's true. Is the problem, and if it's not true, it's not gonna be ultimately very useful to people to formulate ideas on the basis of something that's doesn't seem likely. It's this idea that the source material, the writings, the textual sources must always defer to the majestic, lofty, natural, scientific material, and anything you see there automatically has legitimacy, whereas these written sources, we can always doubt them and say, this guy had an agenda, that's why he wrote that, or it's been tampered with through the ages. And so there's always a suspicion of the historical writings as opposed to this blind, or not blind, intense faith in the scientific data to reveal the truth about the past.
So, having gone through the political, environmental theories, that leaves us with military. Now, normally on the internet, this is sort of the one we'd associate most with, I don't know how to say it, nationalists maybe, like sort of this sense of the Mongols retreated because such and such country was too strong, resistance was too great, and normally this sort of turns into a lot of people going, something about European heavy cavalry, heavy armor, castles or whatnot. Like that alone was too much for the Mongols, and the Mongols were just so afraid of this that they had to withdraw. And it's the military weakness theory. That's Gregis Rogers. I think he sort of defined it as that too. And essentially, the idea being that the Mongols lacked the military capability to conquer Europe, and normally in various YouTube comment sections, this gets reduced to just, Europe was so densely populated and so many castles that the Mongols just had no hope of conquering stuff. They could only work in wide open spaces. Too many forests or cavalry wouldn't be able to maneuver. They'd be picked off, and you will be surprised to know that how should I say this? A modified version of military weakness with a lot of asterisks is actually kind of what's being shown by the historical sources and what Stephen sort of argued for. But it's sort of military weakness in the very short term and not in the long term, without giving too much away. So, Stephen?
Yeah. What you said is very important, that especially in the 1800s, European authors who were, they were in a nationalistic competition, that, France and Germany were competing, and then sometimes it would break into real wars. In this kind of 1800s era, there were these strong nationalist movements, and so in countries that had recently asserted their independence, like Croatia, or were trying to assert their independence, they could look back on their history with pride and say, when the Mongols came, it was our sacrifice. The Poles, for instance, we turned them back at Liegnitz. Or an Austrian author could say, the Eastern Europeans were overrun, but then finally the Mongols came against the great Duke of Austria, Friedrich, and they turned tail and fled. And this is just how it has been. This is the inheritance of our 20th century historians, who were very cynical and skeptical about any kind of idea. They were trying to be dispassionate, unbiased historians in the 20th century, especially the second half. And so anything that smacked of nationalism being driven by a sort of pride, it was dismissed. And that's where we've been ever since, that these serious historians very much have doubted that European military operations had anything to do with the Mongol withdrawal. That essentially the European military effort's almost a big nothing. And what's really, the battle that's really going on is the Mongols versus the environment, or the Mongols versus themselves. There's potential for civil war in politics. Now, despite anything I've said up till now, or we've said, I want to say that I think the political things, the political realities, they played a role in these events. They definitely did. The environment, it could have played a role. It's just, I don't think it was the decisive one, because it's not showing up in the sources, but what gets so often dismissed is the military factor, the resistance of the locals, and the potential for resistance that the Mongols may have perceived. Don't forget, if we can overestimate the Mongol ability to conquer everybody, the Mongols in their own time could have overestimated enemies as well. They could have heard about crusades, and I know they did, and if we believe certain authors, the Mongols really overestimated the European ability to wage a crusade successfully without everyone getting scurvy and dying. Or forgetting to bring food and water and suddenly finding themselves trapped on an island in the Nile River and surrounded. So things like that would happen in real life, but the Mongols still thought the Europeans were formidable. How do we know this? We know it because it shows up in the sources, in the Chinese sources, and implied in the Mongolian sources. It shows up in the Persian sources. It shows up across Asia, and it shows up in European sources. There's a widespread agreement that Europe was going to be a tough nut to crack, even before the Mongols invaded. Even in the secret history of the Mongols, you have Chagatai himself, so Chinggis Khan's second son, and it's portrayed as if he's sort of been gathering intelligence on like the western end of the steppe and stuff, and he refers to the people in the far west as they are people with sharp swords and they will fight to the death and these sorts of things. In Simon of Saint Quentin's account of a Dominican embassy to Bajunoyan in the Caucasus in 1248 or so, 1247, 1248, yeah, you could say. And he receives his embassy, and he sort of reacts with alarm at sort of hearing about Louis IX's preparations for the Seventh Crusade. Seventh Crusade. And I mean, it's a reasonable thing. All of a sudden, there's an army showing up, and you react with alarm. But these are not isolated things. In the Yuan Shi, the biographies of Subadai Batar, so obviously the famous general, the commander of the Mongol army in Hungary and stuff. What it's showing is not an absolute walkover in Hungary. What it's showing is the Mongol vanguard getting repulsed on the bridge over the Shayo River. What it's showing is Subadai basically needing to whip the princes into shape and shame them into keep pressing on with the campaign. What's the Armenian Hethum of Koricus? Yes, so he's a Cilician Armenian who ends up writing in French, or dictating it in French. And what he's reporting is sort of rumors of Mongol defeats in Hungary. Juvayni and Rashid al-Din, same thing. It's generally showing a difficult course. Juvayni has Batu reacting with concern over the army, over the Hungarian army, needing to ask all the soldiers in his army, including the Muslims, to pray for victory, and sort of things on and on and on like this. The account of the Yuan Shi and the difficulties on the bridge are actually nicely mirrored by Master Roger's account and Thomas of Split, where they show the same thing. They show this fierce fighting over the bridge. They have the Mongol advance force is forced back. The crossing over the Shayo River is essentially botched. And this is part of the fighting between Subadai and Batu that emerges, is basically each one blaming the other for getting the timing wrong. Subadai is trying to build this pontoon bridge. The river's quite wide and deep. There actually was flooding in this case because of the floodplain. And the second crossing isn't able to succeed or show up in time. And then when they actually get to the Hungarian camp, you have the Knights Templar and the whatever knights under Bela IV's brother Koloman are going out and describe fighting like to the last man or something. And they're putting the Mongols through all of this trial. The Battle of Muli is not an easy victory. It's an incredibly hard fought thing. And furthermore, it's a hard fought battle after 5 years
of hard fighting across all of Western Asia. The Rus princes, well, it's popularly portrayed as just the Mongols went through and they burned everything and killed everything and just had an easy time. And it is true, they burned and killed a lot of things. But there's fierce resistance at some of these Rus cities. The city of Kozelsk?
Yes, this is a Russian city that put up very stiff resistance. That's what you're mentioning, right?
Several weeks of resistance that Batu was unable to break through initially. There is a battle with the Rus, which ends up costing the life of one of Chinggis Khan's sons, Kolgan.
Yeah, I mean, it was a brutal war. I mean, that's one of Chinggis Khan's premier sons. Now, granted, Kolgan's not one of the four sons of Berta. Yeah, who are going to inherit the throne, but he was the next one. Of all his non-dynastic sons.
The first-ranking, middle-ranking son.
Yes, he's as high as any of those and as premier as any of them ever got. And yet he died in combat not far from Moscow on the Oka River, according to the very reliable Mongol reports. It's a very dry report, but think of the impact of that. This is Chinggis Khan's own son. But let's assume, now that Chinggis Khan has become this very revered ancestor figure, to have one of his sons die in combat must have been quite a psychological shock to the conquerors.
And what you might get an idea from this map here, and of course, first of all, this is not listing every single city that the Mongols, or site the Mongols attacked. It's listing a lot of them. But you have to imagine, this is, by the time they get to Hungary, they've been on campaign 5-6 years. They've traveled thousands of kilometers, and they fought potentially hundreds of battles, because there's how many minor skirmishes and things. And in the southern steppe here, in the Caucasus, we don't have very good coverage from the sources, so we don't really know sort of the specifically how many battles are being fought or what battles in the steppes between Kipchak forces and the like. We know some, we don't know all of them. So even if the Mongols are winning every battle, and I think they more or less do win every single recorded battle of this part of that campaign, you're going to suffer losses. Men get injured, horses get injured. Men, you're sitting on a horse for essentially 5 years straight doing nothing but fighting. At the very least, there's going to be some guys with some sprained shoulders or, just day-to-day wear on your body like that, let alone the wear from being in battle. And a lot of these battles are sieges. And we know, I think it's Kozelsk, where there's like a sally by the garrison, and the sons of the commanders in that Mongol army get killed in the garrison, and there's so many bodies that they can't even find these commanders' sons anymore. There was enough bodies that there was a very profitable trade in transporting these bodies back to Mongolia for a large cemetery for those killed on the campaign. John, is it Plano Carpini or Rubruck who and so during his embassy to Mongolia, he accidentally wanders into this ceremony and just about gets beaten by the guards until he explains that he was an embassy and he didn't know any better. While it's very popular to show this as just an absolute walk in the park for the Mongols, there isn't really a military campaign that is a walk in the park in sort of that kind of easy sense. It's still a lot of work. They're still losing men and stuff. And by the time you get to Kiev, 1240 or so, part of the army leaves. This is Guyuk and Mönk. So two of the senior princes of the army, two of the senior princes of the empire leave. And I think, do some princes accompany them too, or is it just the two of them?
only the two of them are really mentioned prominently, but I believe other princes must have accompanied them.
This guy's part of their party, presumably. So they leave. And these princes, they're not going by themselves. They're going with their guards. They're probably going with whatever contingents they commanded. So what's the common rule of thumb is that every named commander has like a two-man or something. So let's assume these, even if these are both half-strength forces, let's assume only 5,000 men in each two-man, which it seems to be kind of the regular size two-mans ended up being. That's 10,000 men of the army just left. Now, they've been suffering losses all the way. They've been suffering... Some are going to have to be left back to hold certain points, garrison certain regions in the steppe, and maintain these routes of communication, maintain any lengthy sieges, and say the Caucasus, for example, where access was quite difficult. The rough estimate for the army at the start of the campaign is usually about 130,000 men. By the time they get to Hungary, winter 1240, you might be, let's say, 60,000 men for sake of argument. And then this is a force that then gets split up further to go into Poland, Hungary, several routes into Hungary. So you don't have more than, say, 20,000 Mongol troops in a given front. They are not bringing this massive superiority to all of these engagements. There's a sense that the Battle of Muhi is actually fought before the Mongol plan it actually gets fully into place. They invade Hungary from several routes, so you end up with 4 or 5 distinct armies marching into Hungary through various passes in the Carpathians. And it seems like probably the plan was they'd all sort of surround the Hungarian main army. But the Hungarian main army actually leaves Pest sooner than the Mongols are expecting. They pursue Shiban's troops back to the Shayo River and then refuse to cross the river and kind of muck up whatever plan Subutai or Batu kind of had there. But also, now Subutai and Batu, with 10 to 20,000 men, are now facing the entirety of the Hungarian army, not really in the conditions they had planned.
It's a really important point you brought up. If you look at this map, by the time they've reached Kiev, the Mongols have covered thousands of kilometers, battled such warlike people as the Alans, the Ossetians, the Asut, as the Mongolians called them, the Bulgars. These guys were no joke. According to Friar Julian, who saw their armies, they could field 50,000 horsemen. The Rus principalities. Nobody has ever found invading Russia in the winter a good idea. Or, no, they've done it, but it hasn't worked out. Except the Mongols, really. There might be a few other examples that in obscure chronicles, but this is the only really big one I know of where a winter invasion of Russia worked out. And yet it was brutal fighting, one city after another. Personal combat by Guyuk against the Alans and their city of Magas that we see in the Caucasus Mountains. But Munka, who also later became Khan, displayed valor at Ryazan. Personally, he was in the combat, fighting hand to hand, according to the sources we have. So they must have been really worn out by the time this big 5-pronged invasion of Hungary happens. And we have to realize that Hungary was much bigger back then than it is now. It's pretty much this whole Carpathian basin all the way to the Adriatic Sea in Croatia and Dalmatia. But so this was a big, massive operation stretching from Poland all the way to Romania today. But what I think explains the Battle of Muhi being left to Batu and his brothers Shiban and Subutai, and why these others might not have helped, is because they had their own problems fighting these other major armies simultaneously. And also that might be related to the fact that this territory is going to be divided. And the Mongols believe it's a wealthy kingdom. They've heard things to this effect. It's got to be divided, at least with some kind of semblance, of fairness. You can't imagine that one of the sons of Tului, Bocek, would go and invade and risk his life, and then at the end of this invasion he just hands it all over to Batu. That's not really how the Mongols worked. There had to be some kind of division amongst...
Well, they call it, so that's in the Mongol Empire, it's the idea is that this is all the shared property of the House of Chinggis Khan. So wherever you fight, that family gets Inju lands. So in the case of the Jochids, the Golden Horde, territories Jochi had attacked in China, for example, they could keep claiming revenues and taxes from that and continue to do so basically up until the fall of the Yuan dynasty. So it's the similar idea here. Probably initially, you have all the branches of the family fighting here in what's now Russia, Eastern Europe, Kazakhstan, whatever. So where Guyuk's fighting, he's probably imagining, okay, the cities I conquered, these will now be Inju, they will be revenue for the line of Ogedai. And likewise, where the sons of Jochi fight, they think this will be for the Jochids, sons of Tolui, same thing, sons of Chagatai, they're all represented here. And probably, and I think you highlighted this in your dissertation, some of the infighting we see at the command level probably comes from the fact, or a sense from some of these princes are going, well, what am I getting out of this? Am I and the members of my lineage fighting and dying so all these cities can go to the Jochids?
You have to think that must have been a big part of this. Because we like to imagine that maybe some bigger thing was happening, that the Mongol ideology of world conquest is so deep and so thoroughly ingrained in people that they're self-sacrificing. Well, that might work at the commoner level, and that might work on a lot of people, but up at this level of the princes, you can bet there's arguments about division of spoils and how things are going to be divided and who gets what. And we know this happened because Rogerius says after the Battle of Muhi, they start to arrange the distribution of the territory amongst the nobles of the Mongols. Yeah, and this is we see this in all of the campaigns all over the empire. When Hulagu in his army marches to complete the conquest of Iran, Baghdad, and such in the 1250s, there's Jochid troops sent to that army to confirm Jochid Injulans. And part of the reason for the war between Berka and Hulagu Khan is that Berka, as a son of Jochi, was under the impression that Baghdad was kind of his territories, should have been, as part of Western Asia, should belong to the Jochids. And when Hulagu sacks the city without consulting him, and then without giving him any of the loot, that is, in Berka's view, a misuse of the empire. And the same sort of factors are going to be at play here. That's a really good point. Berka is a very good illustration. He's a younger brother of Batu, and Simon of St. Quentin, I believe, a European writer from the time, mentions that Berka was taken off of this really lucrative route that traders and emissaries would use to go to Batu. And Batu had him removed off of that route and moved into the kind of
that's
middle of nowhere.
Rubric says that.
Oh, Rubric.
Sorry to interrupt, but yes. And William of Rubric in the 1250s describes Batu Khan moving Berka off of these in the steppe north of the Caucasus because Berka was taking all the gifts from Muslim traders, and so instead sent Berka sort of northwest of the Caspian Sea, I think sort of towards the Ural River.
Yeah, and an emissary who was passing through was expected to have gifts for everybody along the route, all the magnates, all the commanders of 10,000, the Noyans, all the princes. But who got the lion's share of these gifts depended on geography a lot of the time. And so Batu removed Berka, and of course Berka must have been enraged about that. So these guys are not above mundane concerns about wealth and property, and in fact they care a lot about those things. And I think some of the tensions that show up between the princes, a lot of the princes seem to hate Batu, in the secret history, they finally have this explosive argument with him. And I'm sure a lot of modern historians would just think, oh, well, it's a personality conflict, or it's about lineage or something. Well, it could have been about resources. They get mad that Batu drank first, and that's a little bit telling about, does he also drink first from the loot, as it were? Does he also drink first from the land that they conquer? He's not sharing. He's in this for himself. Well, you can imagine that those kind of tensions are starting to build as this war gets harder and harder. or they realize it's not going to be an easy victory. It's brutal. It's dragging on year after year. Everyone in this region seems to want to go down fighting. They don't want to just surrender right away. They're warlike. And so they're not even negotiating. Well, when the Mongols came to Ryazan, they said, we just want 1/10 of everything. That's our policy. And the Russians replied, well, sure, you can have that 1/10 when all of us are dead.
Well, and
that's very telling.
In Hungary too, so they send, actually, interesting enough, an Englishman as a envoy, captured Englishman. And this might be in Matthew Paris or something. There's a reference to something that the Mongols had sent him or other embassies some, I think, 30-something times to Bela IV. Sort of this idea that they keep like, come on, surrender. And I know the popular is they were pursuing the Cumans in there, and that's why they attacked Hungary, for harboring their prisoners. And I'm sure to an extent that probably was a factor. But normally what we see when the Mongols sort of get up to powers who they aren't actively fighting with, for example, in northern India with the Delhi Sultanate, the Mongols are generally more interested in getting a sort of nominal submission, some sort of tribute delivery or something, rather than start a whole new war on top of the war they're actually going. And that's one of the theories around why Chinggis Khan himself did not invade India, is that the Delhi Sultan at the time, Iltutmish, delivered sort of he sent some tribute, he sort of paid off Chinggis Khan in effect. Think of the Pope and Attila the Hun.
And even the King of France, Saint Louis IX, he sent some emissaries with a church service, sort of materials to hold a nice church service, because he heard that the Mongols might be, Christian. Great Khan might be Christian. And so they arrived with the fancy treasures, and the Great Khan's widow immediately took possession of them and showed all these gathered emissaries from all over Asia the treasures, and she said, hey, look, the King of France just submitted to us. And King Louis, when he heard this, deeply regretted ever contacting them.
This is also a great point, too, because although we have tons of examples of the Mongols forcing submission through military efforts and stuff, they much preferred if you just submitted on your own. That's so much easier for them. They don't want to have to expend the troops, the resources, and all this stuff to focus on conquering you. So there's lots of people to be conquered. You have to conquer. It's better if you just submit, because then they don't destroy all of your resources. They don't destroy all your farmland. You can just submit, start paying taxes. That's what the Mongols are happiest with. It seems the Caliph in Baghdad undertook was to some extent paying some sort of tributes in Karakorum, and part of the reason for the when we see Menk's orders to Hulagu and Rashid al-Din, it says see if the Caliph will come out and resume relations, and if he doesn't, then you attack. And same with the Nisari Ismailis, the assassins, and sort of other, and anyone who doesn't immediately get attacked by the Mongols, it's okay, they paid them off in some fashion. Okay, so the Mongols have campaigning for 5 straight years, cover thousands of kilometers, many battles. Men get lost, men get sick. This is just going to be a part of war. So you kind of have to imagine the Mongols threw this spear they threw across Asia, And yeah, it's going through everything, but every time it goes through, there's little bits of the spear are breaking off. So it's still a very sharp spear, but it's not as sharp as it was before. There's also a trend I'd like to highlight too. So what we see in the attacks in the Rus principalities every year is that the fighting begins in the fall and winter. And then in the spring, they start to withdraw so that they can rest their horses in the steppe in the summer. And that's a pretty regular feature of Mongol maneuvers, especially in the lengthier campaigns. In the wars in China, this is employed a lot. So winter and fall, always the preferred season for the Mongols for going on campaign. Or sort of the campaign starts end of summer, start of the fall, and is already underway by winter. You aren't traveling in the winter, you're already fighting once winter starts. That's kind of the distinction there. And then come the spring, you start to withdraw, return to the steppe, because you have to just rest troops, give them a chance to breathe, essentially. It's sort of, think in the First World War, the troops in the trenches, and they'd have like their shift, and you'd spend, however, I don't know, like a week at the front line, and then you get like 2 weeks behind the lines, whatever. I think of it the same kind of idea. And it's a chance for horses to get their weight back up, and sort of men to take stock and heal from injuries and things like this. This happens very consistently, and it's also a chance to sort of re-strategize, get new information, and make a new plan of attack. Subadai does this himself during the end of the war of the Jin dynasty at the start of the 1230s. Now, he's not in overall command, but he's part of the army, they'd attack. They'd struggled to get past the fortress of Tongguan, for example. Subadai suffers a defeat near it, actually. So they retreat for the summer, and again, make a new strategy, and then in the fall, you start again. And for nomads, fall's the best time to make an attack, because that's when all the harvests have come in, or they're in the process of bringing in their harvest. So not only are you going to disrupt the food supplies of this community, but you also can just take them for yourself. Again, this is what happens every year through the Rus principalities. The fightings in the winter, and you retreat to the steppes in the summer. Now, I've kind of always suspected, and not always, when I read Stephen's theory for the first time, that when they get to Hungary, the retreat, the withdrawal, begins in the same kind of idea. It's that, okay, this isn't going well, let's fall back to the steppe and sort of rest men and horses and come up with new plans. Get reinforcements or something. And then they learn of Ogedai's death and rebellion there and don't end up coming back immediately.
An important point is that when they start leaving Europe, they don't know, or let's say when they evacuate Hungary, they don't know that the Khan is dead. And their own report, translated by Rashid ad-Din and included in his Persian chronicle written around 1300, but it's definitely a Mongolian original report, says that when they turned back, the Mongols didn't know that the Khan was dead. So that's also evidence for that point of view, that they didn't receive that information yet. But something that gets overlooked, and so if we take a look at this map here, I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that the Mongols, when they leave, you can see these red and yellow lines, and they're in the Carpathian Basin, which is this sort of boomerang shape of mountains, or you could say, I don't know what kind of shape, a liver, looks like a liver, and inside of that's the heart of the Hungarian kingdom, and these mountains sort of protected it. We can see the Mongols have overcome the mountains from different sides, and they've run into the heart of Hungary, up to the Pest, up to the Danube River, and they even cross the river, but then they evacuate in two groups, at least two groups that we know of, and they make their way down to Bulgaria. that's southwest. That's not a direct rush back to the steppes at all. This is a movement towards, this is trivia for all the listeners, or viewers. What famous medieval metropolis was very close to Bulgaria? And you probably guessed it, Constantinople was there. So I think they were going down, it looks like they may have been considering a run at Constantinople, which was ruled at the time by the Latin Empire. And there's a whole bunch of sources that are just fragmentary, because the Latin Empire, sadly, we don't have any chronicles or histories from it written by its own authors that have ever survived, and not much from Bulgaria either has survived from this time. But there's little pieces of information, and there's archaeological evidence that the Bulgarians and Latins both fought back when the Mongols came. The Latins supposedly won a battle, and then lost the next one to the Mongols. But either way, their emperor was away from the city of Constantinople for a long time. He was on this front line fighting the Mongols. We know that from the sources. And so again, this doesn't look like Batu's running back home. He just got news that Ögedei died. He's got to get out. It looks more like they've kind of, like a bear that's tried to, I don't know if nature metaphors are useful, but like an animal that has moved in on prey or something, and then has found that the prey is resisting more strongly than they thought, so they just kind of tire of it. They're moving on for another target. And I think what you said is correct, that they saunter out of Europe, and they go along, and they even attack tribes in the southern Caucasus around 1242-43. They attack people in the Caucasus region, and then finally they end up at the Volga River, and they hold apparently this meeting on the Volga River in 1244. So they seem like they're just sort of sauntering back out of Europe. They're not in a big rush. They didn't get information that has them running in a beeline back to Mongolia. This is
Master Roger, so again, the fellow who is with the Mongol army at this point, a Hungarian. What he describes is a almost leisurely route back out, and they're being very thorough, sacking every place they didn't sack in the first pass, basically turning over all the stones they didn't turn over the first time. Again, they're not rushing out. They're not out in a panic. They're not, we have to get back and do something. It's not a response to some news. It's a considered and thought out decision. And the army is still in good order. It's not a rout. It's not a panicking retreat. It's a strategic withdrawal.
And it's almost like they're just searching for plunder at this point. After winter 1242, they're just looking for vulnerable places.
I suppose now we've sort of highlighted a couple trends here. So the trouble of a lengthy campaign. Fall back in the summer to rest men and horses, maybe get new intelligence, whatever. I guess the question remains and you can answer this, Stephen, is there sort of a specific point then in Western Hungary, once they cross the Danube, when the Mongols essentially go, this is a little too annoying?
What you should then think about is, if you want to make sense of, okay, why are the Mongols now veering southwest into the Balkans? Why are they now going back to the steppes? What happened immediately before that? And then I guess we should consider their farthest advance westward, which would be Western Hungary, what they call Transdanubia. They'd crossed the river around January, from Christmas Day to mid-January 1242. And now they're in the heartland, they call the Medium Regni of Hungary. This is the heartland, and this is the place with the most wealth. Hungary didn't have huge cities, but the cities it did have that were big were in this place, and the Mongols are now in that place. And they attack a bunch of fortresses, And we have a letter from the Hungarian defenders to the Pope at this time, February 1242. And they said, when the Mongols crossed over the river, we all fell back in good order into our planned fortifications. And all these fortresses and monasteries and castles that are still holding out are holding out really well against the Mongols. And we're not worried about their attacks, but we're worried about getting no help. And I think they were worried about their attacks, but there's a bit of confidence in the Hungarian voice here that might not just be bluff when they're talking to the Pope, because they want help. I think they've upped the defenses, and the defenses are better in that part of the country. And suddenly Mongol sieges are not going very well. And this, they attack 3 major sites in Hungary, Székesfehérvár, Pannonhalma, and Esztergom citadel, and they're repelled in all 3 cases. But these other fortresses we don't hear about, or we only have little bits of information, the Mongols also were losing there. Like in Slovakia, Trenčín, they failed to take Trenčín, Nitra, they failed to take Bratislava, they didn't take almost anything in Croatia. So they chased the King of Hungary down into Croatia now, and they attack Klis fortress, they threaten Spalato, they threaten Trogir, which is called Trau today, where it's called Trogir today, and Trau in ancient sources, but that's where the king was hiding. None of these places, they had old stone Roman fortifications that had been turned into medieval fortresses and walls, and the Mongol sieges are not going well. And there's a lot of improvised fortresses. So long story short, I think these tougher fortifications that start to occur in Transdanubia, in Austria, in Croatia, in Western Poland, very Western Poland, Silesia, in Bohemia, a few places in Moravia, this is modern Czech Republic, and in Slovakia. The Mongols must not be liking these experiences, because these little fortresses all over the place, full of troops and loot, but you can't get at it. And the local people are taking the loot into these things beforehand. And then in the eventuality that a place does fall to the Mongols, in one famous case, the capital of Hungary, the local people burned all their valuable property before the Mongols could get in and seize all the fabric. And fabric was a European commodity that Mongols wanted, because it's hard to manufacture your own fabrics on the steppe, clothing. So that was very valuable to them. And the European defenders torched because they knew they were going to die anyway. The Mongol reputation had sort of preceded them for killing the city dwellers that they didn't need. So the military experience starts to get really negative at the westernmost advance of the Mongols.
Suppose it's useful then to say what specific change in the fortification design occurs west of the Danube that is not present east of the Danube that would cause this.
It's stone fortifications, broadly you could say.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is what we see in, I believe it's Master Roger's account again. I know we keep referring to him, but he is basically one of, if not the most important single source on the invasion in Hungary. So, in what he describes that these sites is in Esztergom's case. So you have the fortified keep, the citadel in the city, and then you have sort of the suburbs around it, and maybe low or wooden walls or no walls. In the case of Pest, for example, they don't start building ditches basically until a couple days before the Mongols show up, and it doesn't turn out great for them. But at Esztergom, what Master Roger describes is essentially, he describes Batu and the army just essentially annihilating the entire city except for the stone keep. That this main center, this main fortified stone building, built up high on an outcropping essentially stands defined compared to the rest of the city.
Yeah, Batu actually orders the execution of some women there. He becomes so frustrated that these women that normally get spared, he orders them executed, and specifically because he lost the loot that was the capital of Hungary. They're not getting the rewards they wanted. They're getting frustrated. Suddenly this war isn't as fun. When you're not just trouncing your opponents, it's not fun at all to conquer the world, apparently. Especially after 6 years of it, fatigue setting in. And then keep in mind, context, right behind Hungary is the Holy Roman Empire, and then France. And then you got England, and you've got Italy with its various powers, and none of this, and the Latin Empire still hasn't been knocked out of the war. The Serbians are still there. The Poles are intact. They've been mauled, but they're still intact. The Kingdom of Bohemia is right there. So this is not going to end the war. Taking Esztergom is not going to end the war and bring the whole fold of Europe into submission to the Great Khan. They are potentially facing their own annihilation. They know about crusades probably by now. They know that a crusade's forming in Germany. They don't know that it's run by a bunch of corrupt and incompetent people who are going to ultimately pilfer the funds.
And breaks up. So the crusade, it's underneath Friedrich Hohenstaufen and his son. And I think the crusade doesn't even get to like the border of the Holy Roman Empire before it just falls apart and they start fighting each other and there's a civil war.
But we know that the Austrian Duke had also, he was also part of these attacks on the Mongols that were coordinated. There were princes from at least their contingents must have been operating together. Mm-hmm. The King of Bohemia.
Well, if you're in the Mongols' position, what you are seeing in the spring of 1242 is that you have these fortified stone keeps, which are at that moment proving that the style of catapults they're using there, these Chinese traction catapults, are proving insufficient to puncture those walls or to puncture them in good time. Or they're struggling to meet at these high, built on top of these rocky outcroppings. They're struggling to make the angle on these because most of where they've been fighting in Rus and China and such thing, these cities, these fortifications, they are built around settlements, and settlements generally are built at low points along rivers in flat areas. It's easy to get your angle on these things, to just pound the walls relentlessly. When you get to these high up mountain or anything built on any hills, outcroppings and stuff, immediately is becoming much more difficult for these catapults to hit. I mean, and this isn't isolated in Europe. When we see, for example, in these assassin fortresses in northern Iran, one of these holds out for 15 years against the Mongols. And the reason the Mongols are able to take most of the assassin fortresses is they basically force the submission of the leader of the Nisari Ismailis and make him convince everyone to submit and then demolish the fortifications afterwards. There's not actually a siege of most of the sites except for a handful of them.
And that's a funny thing because when the gamers who take a strong interest in these things, or the people with a lot of people with a casual interest, let's say, I shouldn't say gamers, but people who've picked up some knowledge about the Mongols, and they love the story of this conquest. But when they consider why Europe didn't fall, they say, well, I don't think these castles could have been an issue because the Mongols conquered the Ismaili assassins. But the devil's in the details, that the Ismaili assassins were duped into surrendering their ruler to the Mongols, and then he was used as a hostage to get all the castles to surrender.
Anyways, again, what we said before, the Mongols, they prefer to have you submit without a fight than actually have to fight you. And it's not because they don't think they can win, it's they don't want to put in the resources to have to fight every single little city. This is part of the reason for the massacres and why the Mongols themselves love to play up and brag about the massacres, is because if you're convinced that fighting the Mongols will result in certain death, not just of yourself and your family, but everyone in your community, in your city, then the stakes are too high. If the point of a siege, like in general, is that you are convinced you can hold out, and that you cannot face this guy in the field, but this guy does not have the resources or the capability to fight off the siege or to besiege you and be successful and move on. It's very labor intensive, time intensive, resource intensive. But if you are under the sincere belief this guy's going to win no matter what, and we see the same thing with the Romans, that the belief in the besiegers' certain victory is as powerful a tool as anything. And that's much of what ancient and medieval warfare is someone playing up the reputation. That's the whole reason everyone thinks the Spartans were so great, is because they had the great PR guys.
Yeah, you can picture how this works in a medieval setting, like the feeling of dread that would set in, to go to your ancient Greek analogy, when you hear, like, you thought this contingent was the Thebans, and then it's like, no, it's actually 50% Spartan. You can just picture the dread, like, oh, no, we didn't know those guys were, like, it's that same idea. The Mongols had a reputation, and they cultivated it. They hung certain bodies upside down in the Caucasus region, in the city of Derbent, or places like this. They hung a dead guy up to represent 1,000 killed, so that you'd see a whole bunch of them hanging, and you'd know each one of these represents 1,000. And they were trying to terrify people, and it really almost worked in Europe, at least against the Hungarians. The king of Hungary was so scared of them that he had a huge explosive tantrum in the city of Spoleto when he arrived, and they didn't have a ship ready for him to take off in case, because he didn't believe these great fortifications, stone, state of the art, made from old Roman ruins. He didn't think they could hold out. And a person who was in that area, Thomas of Spoleto, said that local people were confident to resist the Mongols when they appeared, but the Hungarian refugees who'd fled to Croatia and were staying with them were so terrified that when they realized it was the Tatars who had arrived, that it demoralized everyone in the city. Because the Hungarians were saying, it doesn't matter what your fortifications are like, they're going to make a ramp that goes right over top of your wall. You can't do anything against them. And it was kind of obnoxious for the local people, because it's like, well, first of all, you brought these guys here, and now you're telling us nothing, resistance is futile. But it was the terror that the Mongols really had generated in. So it was almost effective, but there were too many people around. There's just a lot of people, and then not a lot of them are gonna go down without a fight. Yeah.
Now, of course, we're not saying that all in all the Mongol reputation is just PR and stuff, because they were very good at sieges. You kind of have to be that in order to get the reputation going. It's not just paid a bunch of guys to say good things about them. I think there's a sense, too, when the Mongols, they cannot cross the Danube in the first part of 1241. They have to wait till the river freezes. And so there's a lengthy defense of the Danube is presented, and the Hungarians are like trying to break the ice before the Mongols can cross. And because they don't want them to cross, but you kind of get a sense in these couple months that get bought that they're able to sort of improve some of the defenses, improve some of their techniques, bring in whatever, and get sort of like, okay, everyone, get serious about defending this settlement. That the Hungarians were really taken aback by the ferocity of the attack in the first half. And what the Mongols love to do is isolate communities. And they have their Nerga, for example, and they'll surround a certain point and drive all the refugees in, and they'll have their feign retreats, and all there's a whole playbook of ploys that they employ consistently, and they do this very effectively in Eastern Hungary. And in the western part of the kingdom, I guess they sort of, over that winter of 1241, they get a chance to sort of, they've experienced deploys, they're getting news from refugees, and they're sort of I wonder if there's sort of like a doctrine of defense gets like put out by the knowledgeable people. Okay, here's what we should not do. Here's kind of what we should be planning on. And it's still, even with all of that, it's still very destructive when they get to Western Hungary. There's still, like I said, all these suburbs, any place that's unfortified, that is not surrounded by these stone walls, is burnt down and destroyed. It's not, well, just as you're saying, it's not a walk in the park for the Mongols through all this stage. It's definitely not a walk in the park for the Hungarians on the receiving end of it in Eastern Hungary.
And just now, archaeology is revealing the extent of improvised fortifications, just earthworks that the local villagers would do. They'd get together, many different villages would come together in this emergency as the Mongols invaded. And they knew they couldn't count on the royal forces anymore. The king had been defeated, had fled across, to Austria. The other king, his brother Kalman, had been mortally wounded. The royal armies essentially decimated at the Battle of Muhi and in the retreat, panicky retreat after. These people are on their own in the eastern part of Hungary, on the Great Hungarian Plain. But they didn't just sit there and die. Some of them did. You can find them. But a whole lot of them gathered in center points around a church, usually. And they made circular ditches and rows of them. So maybe 2 or 3 at least. And they used to think these were cemeteries. That's why people were thrown off. Even though, our eyewitness, Rogerius, Master Roger, tells us that people were doing this, gathering around a church from many villages and fighting to the death. Now they're finding them all. So, hilariously, for a long time, archaeologists just thought these circular rings around the churches were old medieval cemeteries, but then they started finding guys with arrows in them, and they all had 1241 coins in their boot or whatever, and they've got weapons, and they're in various scenes of combat and dismemberment, and they started to realize, oh, this isn't a cemetery, this is a last stand. This is Custer's last stand over and over again. But they thought, okay, they found some examples. Now they're realizing this was systematic. The Mongols were fighting, they'd fight to one of these, and then they'd go 30 kilometers, and it's another battle to the death. And so it shouldn't really surprise us that they had a special cemetery for Mongols who died in Hungary, in Mongolia, because probably a lot of them die overrunning these trench works.
Yeah. And we shouldn't dismiss a ditch as they made a ditch. This is how inept these were. Like a ditch, sort of one of those ancient basic tools of siege warfare, of defense. And the reason it's used even in modern warfare is it's a simple and effective sort of defense. It's right away. It's just stopping anyone from just riding their horses right up and taking advantage. It's just a ditch that has to be filled in, or they have to push through the gateway, which is going to be fortified in some fashion. And when we see in Master Roger's account is what they're employing to attack and actually take many of these settlements is their tricks at first. They're tricking the Hungarians into thinking they're going to be attacking from, for sake of argument, the east side, and then the rest of the troops were in hiding, and they come around, they attack from the west side, and now attack from the now unguarded point, or they'll bypass the settlement. The settlement thinks the Mongols have left, and then once their guards let down, the Mongols come running back and kill everyone who's come out of hiding, and things like that. And that's what they prefer, is taking everyone off guard and surprising them. And again, they don't want to face active resistance all of the way. They have not brought the numbers for that. There's no, and I know sometimes this is sort of that, I think this is more so that Russian popular cultures that the Rus are sort of like this Thermopylae kind of thing, where the Rus were all brave warriors and they were just overwhelmed by sheer numbers of Mongols. Well, they weren't. The army itself is very large, but it's never operating in one place. It's like all of these little units all over the place, and they don't want to have to face constant resistance for every single step of the way.
No, it's kind of funny. To think of this like World War I in any way would seem, at first, on the surface, this war must seem like it's a totally different world. It's a highly mobile war, whereas World War I is this trench warfare. But shockingly, the war in Hungary had an element of trench warfare and slow gains and yeah.
With this in mind, when the Mongols withdraw in 1242, they're thinking, okay, we're not having great success taking these citadels, these stone keeps. We're only, the expectation is there's only more of this the further west you go. And what they're hearing is that the Holy Roman Emperor is putting together this huge crusading army. And of course, they don't know the actual details that it's going to fall apart. They don't know
and
that
there's
yet.
A 500-year-old wizard named Papa,
the Great Pope,
and he's overseeing everything, and everyone's loyal to him.
Mm-hmm. So
if they would have overestimated the possible danger.
And that's always been the suggestion, or everyone always makes the suggestion that when the Mongols go into Poland at the same time that they go into Hungary, that part of this is a maneuver to prevent the Polish princes from providing troops to assist the Hungarians. Now, whether such a thing would actually have occurred is doubtful. It's hard to say. It's unlikely that the Polish army would have been able to, or any Polish army, because it's not like a state of Poland, it's 5 duchies, would have been able, it's doubtful such an army would have been able to get organized and make it to Hungary. But the Mongols, they tend to think everyone does warfare like them. So what would they do? Well, they would have sent a sort of flanking force like that. So they overestimate the offensive capabilities of these European armies. And they're assuming, okay, we don't want to get trapped. The whole Western campaign is like a whole army of like pincer movements, preventing anyone from linking up and joining them. When this army's moving in the Western Steppe, there's also an army under Shormohunoyon, which is moving through northern Iran and the Caucasus and into Anatolia, securing that flank too. And then same things I would repeat it on smaller and smaller scale in the Rus principalities and into Europe. So they're always overestimating them. And so when they're just getting like rumors from their spies, embassies, whatever, of this huge army in Germany, of all these castles and things. Again, their troops have spent all these years on campaign. They've been suffering losses, and now they're only being promised no easy victories, just more fighting for every scrap of land. In this case, the Mongol withdrawal is not because of environment or mud, or because they've lost, or because of Ögedei's death, but essentially going as like a strategic move, looking at it and going, if we keep fighting, we will just eventually ground our army into dust. They've only been in Hungary about a year. They don't conquer anything in less than a year. Even for the Mongols, that's far too quick. They spent 70 years to take all of China. When the first year they attack, for the first 3 years they're fighting in China, it's attack again in the fall, and then retreat in the summer, and then resume warfare in the fall. To them, there is no doubt that Europe, the Hungarians, all of them are going to submit and be conquered in the future, but it's not going to happen by 1243. So what's the point in sending all these men to die?
Just to confirm what you said there, with a source that kind of nicely reflects what you said. John of Plano Carpini again, a friar sent by the Pope to Mongolia. He traveled with these Mongols, and they eventually somehow they communicated with each other. And he tells the story of the Battle of Muhi from the Mongol side, if you can believe it. If you believe he's not twisting their version. And what he says was they were close to fleeing at the Battle of Muhi. Batu pulled out his sword at one point to stop the retreat of the Mongols. And this kind of thing is implied in the Asian sources, that they wanted out during the battle or around the time of the battle, and Subutai had to stop them. But in this story, it's Batu. And I don't think we have to doubt this story necessarily. And apparently Batu pulled his sword out, and he said, let's just stay here, and if we're going to die, let's die here, because Genghis Khan prophesied that we were destined someday to be annihilated. So if today's that day, let's just go out with a bang. Now, it's very weird for Carpini to have made that up or something. And I'll just tell you why I think. One reason I think that would be weird to make up is that it kind of makes the Mongols look really good. There's a heroic element to that saying. That it's almost like those sort of epos poems of the Central Asian hero or something. Like, he faces this with courage and he says, if this is the day, let's die heroically. And he stops the retreat. And this is a hated, evil individual from the Pope's point of view, from the papal curious, who's killed millions of Christians, or I don't know how many, thousands upon thousands of Christians, and non-Christians, but especially the Christians would have been a problem for the Pope. Seemingly for no reason. They don't know why the Mongols are doing this, and it's an outrage. They think it's an absolute outrage that they've killed all these people in Hungary. And this story makes him look heroic at that moment of near defeat. But doesn't that sum it up what this invasion of Europe was really like then, if it's true? If that story is true, that for the Mongols, on the Mongol side, it's a panicky retreat, it's a narrow, it's fatal resignation that they might be dying here, that they're out in this salient, deep in this strange part of the world called Europe, and that there's enemies on every side, and they're deep, deep into it. They've been abandoned by some of the most powerful princes, and now they're losing. Potentially, they're going to lose here, and they're all going to die. It's like, now I think that's a more realistic version of what the Mongol outlook was at certain times in 1241-42 than this comic book story, where they didn't break a sweat. They just clobbered everyone, and never was there a moment of self-doubt that they were going to just win all 50 battles in a row.
Because humans never experience self-doubt. Well, even also on the point of Carpini there, so it's interesting that it's such a similar portrayal to the Iron-Shir's account, where it's the commander having to sort of whip the princes back into shape to keep fighting. Now, Carpini and the Chinese authors, they did not communicate. Carpini didn't read this Chinese source and go, okay, I'm going to write that. The Chinese authors didn't read Carpini's account and go, that's a good story, but we'll put Subadai instead. No, they got it from the same source. Who's the same source in both cases? The only one connecting Europe and China? The Mongols. They both heard, this is both what's coming from the Mongol accounts. And the Mongol accounts of the Battle of Mui, just of the Battle of Mui, let alone anything else, are of a botched crossing, princes, parts of the army wanting to fall back, and the commanding officer, the commander, having to get them to stand their ground. And Subadai in the biography there goes, I don't care, the rest of you can run, but I'll keep marching onto the Hungarians alone if I have to. And again, these aren't the Chinese making this up to denigrate the Mongols. This is from the Mongolian military documents translated into Chinese and collected from the Yuan dynasty. If it was an easy battle, the Mongols wouldn't be writing that. They'd be writing about how the Hungarians shattered before them. But instead, they're portraying it as sort of a heroic effort, that it's heroic on their part to have overcome such a fearsome enemy.
Academic historians, being like lawyers and very slick, they might say, aha, but you see, you've fallen for it. The Mongols portrayed it as this very desperate struggle in Hungary because they wanted the glory of their victory to shine all the brighter because it was so hard fought. And then all I would say to that, I don't subscribe to that view. I'd say, well, then how come they didn't do that about every battle they won? How come some of them are easy? How come they specifically said about this battle it was one of the greatest deeds they ever did? Giovanni said this. One of the greatest battles, toughest battles they ever fought was Muhi. He was a contemporary insider of Karakorum, governor of Baghdad. Why would he give a shout out? Why would he give props to the Hungarians like that? What does he have to do with Hungarians? What would he want them to look good for? But here's a perfect metaphor of how scholars can fall into this fallacy when dealing with material like this. Richard III of England. I like to bring him up. Shakespeare said he had a bunchback. He had some sort of disfigurement of the back. Modern historians, when they encounter these accounts of Richard III having this disfigurement, before they found him a few years ago under a parking lot, but before they found him, they have no body of Richard III. And the debate is just, do you think this is true or not? And a lot of the historians were skeptical because they said people just didn't like Richard III, and they thought he was morally repugnant. So they thought a physical deformity was a sign of a moral deformity. That's how medieval or early modern people looked at the world, so they just propagandized that he had a bunchback. But then they found him a few years ago, and sure enough, he had severe scoliosis. Now, he may have been able to ride a horse and fight and all these things, but it looks like a severe, noticeable spinal deformity. And what I would say now that the mystery is solved, and we have Richard III and we have him with the back problem, I'd say, well, if this is really about propaganda because Richard III was a bad person, why didn't they just accuse every king you didn't like? Why didn't they say, oh, he's got a bunchback? If Matthew Paris, the chronicler, didn't like the Pope or the Emperor, why didn't he say, hey, Frederick II's got a bunchback? How come just Richard III? Well, now we know, because he did have a bunchback. It's sort of, to take this further, it's like, if the sources keep saying that the Hungarian battle was desperate, and the campaign was desperate, if the Asian and European sources alike say this, the reason's probably because it was desperate, and it was a hard fight. And it's not, we don't have to look into the minds of the writers about their agenda all the time. And only see what we see as being a product of agendas. It's just not gonna further our understanding of history.
Exactly. There's times when you should read more into something, but at a certain point you have to wonder, okay, if all of these writers are saying this, how are every single one of them, even the ones who weren't involved with the Mongols, how are they all lighting the Mongol propaganda? I mean, it's not impossible, but at a certain point you have to wonder, okay, if all of the sources are saying this, why are we going to so much work to disregard them and put in a different narrative than what is in them?
Yeah, well said.
So, why I really buy into this theory too, that the Mongols saw this as just essentially a temporary strategic retreat. Right? They didn't see Europe as some unconquerable target. They saw that the army they had present in 1241 was insufficient to the task of completing the conquest of Europe. And the Mongols just thought, okay, we fall back now, and we will come back later with the proper army. And that's what we see from the Mongol-European contacts over the following years, is the Mongols keep sending letters demanding submission. Guya Khan is basically saying to these Franciscan envoys, I am going to go there and finish the conquest. I'm going to bring a huge army, complete the conquest of the West, do this and that. And these keep happening, and the Khans of the Golden Horde keep sending messages to the Hungarian kings demanding that they submit. You mentioned Guyuk's widow in the end of the 1240s. She receives an embassy from the King of France and goes, I've taken the submission of the King of France. William of Rubruck, during his journey, he remarks that the Batu was so knowledgeable about, I think it's Rubruck and Batu, but he remarks that Batu knew who the strongest monarchs in Europe were. It was the King of France, the Pope and then the Emperor. Is that what the order he gave?
The King of France and the Emperor, and he said the King of France is actually stronger than the Emperor of Germany. He took an interest, and I always thought that was funny that the Mongols actually took an interest in these people, like in this distant land. They start to learn who's who, and that might be a sign of definitely they still want to conquer them, but that might be a sign that they're taking them more seriously than just a rabble that's going to.
They're looking at the strengths, what they're going to have to face, who they're going to be facing. And that's when sometimes you see people go, okay, the Mongols, they didn't conquer here because they thought it was so poor and didn't have anything they wanted and stuff. Well, first of all, the wealth of a region was not what made the Mongols conquer it or not in the first place. The belief was everything's going to be conquered. And second, they did see lots they liked in Europe. They liked the fabric work, as I already mentioned, the textiles, and the metalworking. So the silvertree and Karakoram made by a Parisian goldsmith. And of course, in the sole reference to the people that Chagatai gives to the people in the western end of the continent in the secret history of the Mongols is a reference to the quality of their swords. Yeah, I think the Mongols fully intended and fully believed that they were going to come back and conquer Europe. They did not see anything in Europe that they saw, this is a target we cannot.
Yeah, their later messages in the 1400s can confirm, or in the 1240s, later 1240s, after they invaded and withdrew from Hungary, their messages to Europe confirm two points you've raised really well. One, they did plan to conquer them still, because they're still threatening Europe. Surrender or die. And they meant it. Their threats are going to lose all meaning if the Mongols don't enforce those threats. And that's dangerous for their lives, because then people lose respect for them. So if they said it, they meant it. I'm going to take their word for it. They planned to come back to Europe. But secondly, another point you raised, and this just confirms it, is that they even tried to rationalize with the Europeans, like the Pope. They tried to, and the King of France, the top rulers as they saw it. They tried to rationalize with them that, don't you see that if you surrendered, it would be better? It would be healthier for you. It would be good for world peace if all people were under one banner together. Can't you see how much better that would be to avoid the war? But just think about it. Think of the harmony of the whole of Eurasia under one government. And it confirms what you said, that they wanted Europe to submit. They needed it to submit, but they were not looking forward to that battle anytime soon. Which goes to show you it was a brutal war.
Mm-hmm. So the Mongols were under the belief that if they brought sufficient troops and had sufficient support, then they would conquer Europe. Imagine if 100,000 troops had reached the edge of Europe and advanced like altogether. How different that would, essentially doubling the amount of troops who've been present in 1241. And look at the damage that happened in 1241. So obviously we have these castles and cities holding out in 1242 there. But imagine now the Mongols didn't have to worry about their rear, for example, because now there's just Mongol troops everywhere. If now we can spend the time to choke out these major points, you end up with a different siege. You end up with, and what we see in later examples, the Mongols go, we didn't have the right tools, the right siege machines for this job, so now we're going to basically scour the empire for the right technology. Like they would, if they put the political and military will to it, I don't doubt that they would have found a means to conquer you. It's
well said. They were kind of leaving it to the end.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the far western part of the continent. It's just the reality of the position. It's going to end up kind of taking second or third place compared to things closer to home, like the Song dynasty, for example. So that is the reassessment. So, in fact, it is mostly military necessity. The short term, the Mongols realized that in 1242, the army they had would not have been capable of continuing to fighting and conquer all of Europe. But they certainly imagined that they had the capability to conquer Europe and fully intended to return and do so. The way history ended up sort of unfolding is that they didn't. If Europe had been geographically closer to Mongolia, easier for them to attack, maybe we'd be speaking a little different here, but we find it insufficient to ascribe the withdrawal in Europe to the death of Ögedei Han, to immediate environmental and ecological reasons, or to any inherent European military or defensive or offensive strength or quality of armor or what have you. Essentially, a force that was too small to get the job done was sent in the 1240s. The Mongols made this realization and pulled those troops out and would have come back, but things went a little differently. A lot of princes and khans drank themselves to early deaths, and that did a lot to help any region on the extremity of the Mongol Empire. So that is my takeaway from this. Stephen, do you have any closing statements, thoughts, suggestions for further reading?
Yes, Jack, there is one thing I would like to add. That what's surprising is that people reading about this and just, reading the basic summary of this story, they might be annoyed about being offered a revisionist take on it. But if you engage with this consideration and consider that the story isn't so simple, then what you get, I think, is a fuller and deeper story, and one that is supported by the materials from that time that have come down. Archaeology and textual sources and all kinds. Numismatics, every kind of material seems to be feeding into a more complex picture of the Mongol relationship to Europe. And like you said, it was just a conquest that didn't quite get finished before the empire ended. There were a lot of people who believed that they should just try to hold out until the Mongol Empire flies apart. Centrifugal forces just rip it apart, like so many other steppe nations. And what's shocking is that this empire stayed together, but even when it broke apart, it lasted in these khanates like the Golden Horde and the Yuan and the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai dynasty that then bequeathed lasting influences over the entire world that exists to today. And so it really is a story that I'm sometimes surprised Hollywood or Netflix hasn't jumped on, because they haven't fully explored this Mongol history, because it really is one of the more amazing times you're ever going to read about in the history books, including the invasion of Europe.
Well, they did do The Rising Hawk. Did you see that? It's
No.
Ukrainian. Don't watch it. Ukrainian movie about the invasion of Europe. It's not very good. So maybe it's better if they don't touch it, because although they could touch it, and then I'll do a bunch of reviews about, wow, look how bad this show is, and I don't know. So that's that. That's our talk about the theories regarding the Mongol withdrawal from Hungary. I'm excited to see the comments from people who missed the point and are now accusing us of being Eurocentrist fascists or Mongol imperial supremacists, and are now using this to argue that the Europeans were so tough and their armor was so good, and just missed the point. And now there's someone right now writing a comment about European heavy cavalry chasing down the Mongols. I look forward to looking at it and glossing over it with my eyes. So that's that. If you've listened to all of this, however long this ends up being, thank you. You can hear us talk about it more on the Kings and Generals podcast, which came out last year. I also wrote a number of lengthy podcast episodes just in general on the invasion of Europe, a 4-part series. If you want to hear more detail just on the course of events, you can read more about it in Stephen's chapter in the Routledge Handbook of East Central Europe. His chapter is called Mongol Inroads into Hungary. There will be a link to the page in the description or on screen right now. I'm not sure. Again, I am not being paid to say that. That's just because Stephen wrote it, and I'm suggesting you can check it out. So,
and I do hope someday to turn Conquest and Withdrawal, my dissertation, into a book. If anyone is patient enough, you'll get the whole book version of this, and you can read and decide for yourself if this is just the ravings of a crackpot lunatic, or if there's actually some merit to this idea. And I'll give you a spoiler. It's the former.
Good. Well, that's what they'll put on the tagline on the book. It'll be like some raving lunatics, conquest and withdrawal. Be a bit of a fun one to cite. Thank you all for listening. I'm the Jackmeister, Mongol history. Just call me Jack. It's fine. Thank you, Stephen, for coming on, giving us so much of your time.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure.
I hope we have opened your mind a bit, maybe gotten you to think a bit about the Mongols and the invasion of Europe, and open to the historical method. Or maybe we just wasted your time. Who knows? Either option's fine by me. All right.
See ya.
Ciao.